Hello, welcome to today's webinar. Space is still available on Trump's Board of Peace, Peace Plan, and Davos. I'm Bob McConnell, co-founder of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation, and the foundation is pleased that 5 members of our Friends of Ukraine Network, FOUN, are available to join today's discussion. Ambassador John Herbst, former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, head of Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council and chair of FOUN's National Security Task Force. General Phil Breedlove, U.S. Air Force retired. 4-star General, Phil served as the 17th Supreme Allied Commander Europe. Ian Brzezinski, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO Policy. Ambassador Dan Fried, former Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, U.S. Ambassador to Poland, and Wiesner Family Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Not listed on our announcement because of another commitment, which was changed this morning due to the weather here in Washington, Debra Cagan is able to join us. Debra, a tremendous asset to FOUN and our webinars, has held a number of very senior positions at both the State Department and the Department of Defense. It's an understatement to say that a lot has happened in the last week in the field of international relations, much of which impacts Ukraine. President Trump formally announced his Board of Peace. There were discussions in Switzerland and since on the purported peace plan to end Russia's unprovoked war on Ukraine, the United States, and the West. And of course, there has been the annual meeting in Davos that included the Board of Peace, the peace plan, and much more. We'll start our discussion this morning with Ambassador Herbst, who has just returned from Davos. John, I'm not going to ask any questions. I'm just going to say the floor is yours.
Okay. Davos was particularly interesting this year. I think it's safe to say that President Trump has demonstrated an extraordinary ability to attract attention to himself wherever he goes, and literally every day of the week. And that was clearly apparent in Davos last week. He and his large team dominated the stage. The issue which gathered the most attention and the most controversy was Greenland. Trump's talking about the need for the U.S. to acquire Greenland, the threats of potential military operations against a NATO ally had everyone deeply concerned. As you know, he dropped that idea of a military operation, I think, on day one in Davos. But he talked about large tariffs on the 8 European countries strongly defending the sovereignty of Denmark in Greenland. He dropped that a day later in Davos, and everybody breathed a sigh of relief. The news reports he dropped it because a framework agreement was achieved, at least the principles of a framework agreement was achieved. And maybe that's true. I say maybe because unusual in Trump world, we don't have any details of that agreement. And those of us who follow this closely, and I think that includes everyone on this panel, knows that the United States pretty much had the run of Greenland through an agreement reached with Denmark in 1951, allowing us to do pretty much whatever we wanted. So the question is, did in fact all the tactics that preceded the announced framework agreement, did they have any impact on Denmark's position, or is this simply something that we could have achieved without any furor? And the answer to that is I don't know. But it is true that the furor did shake the confidence of many of our NATO allies in, just to be polite, the predictability and reliability of U.S. leadership. And I think that's unfortunate. But thank goodness we are past that. And I think we should credit, although some people would disagree with me, Secretary General Rutte, who took a soft approach to President Trump, which Rutte's way since Trump returned to the White House, And that made it easier for Trump to step back. So I would at least note that. Bob, you referred to the Board of Peace, and that is a very unusual structure, I'd have to say. This began, I think everyone knows, as an idea to help calm the crisis in Gaza, and once Israel and Hamas stopped shooting at each other. And in that context, I think that made perfect sense. But clearly, the White House has decided to try to broaden this globally. And they've got, a dozen plus members who signed up. Unfortunately, we're not talking the cream of the crop of the international community. We're not talking about strong democratic states. We're not talking about American allies who've largely decided not to join. And there are some disreputable members who are now part of the board. That includes Mr. Lukashenko from Belarus. President Putin has said he would join, but in a very cynical and even predictable way said the $1 billion fee for entry would come from the Russian frozen state assets. In other words, not from money that Putin actually controls, and something that would undermine Western policy designed to stop Putin's aggression in Ukraine. So I'm not sure that this board has an illustrious future in front of it, but it did take up some time in Davos. I think the third issue worth mentioning, although there are more on the table in Switzerland, is, of course, Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Zelensky did come to Davos from a country that has been devastated, whose civilians have been devastated by the cynical, massive attacks on on Ukrainian energy, leading to substantial destruction of power to Ukrainian civilians. So in weather which is colder than we're experiencing right now in Washington, weather that goes below 0 Fahrenheit, many Ukrainians are living without energy, without water, through their faucets. They're getting by. They're determined to get by because they know living under the Russian yoke would be far worse than living under Russian bombs, even in a very cold winter. But Zelensky, managing that crisis, decided to come to Davos to make sure that he could present his ideas to President Trump. I think that was smart. Zelensky has learned how to work with the president, I think, ever since that infamous Oval Office meeting in late February. They had a good meeting, according to both Trump and Zelensky. Following that was something that people who have a microscope might call the first Russian concession in peace negotiations. What do I mean by that? It was agreed in Davos that there would be trilateral talks, US, Russian, Ukrainian, in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, which took place over the weekend, post-Davos. Now, I call that a concession because the Russians have refused this. Trump's been talking about it. Zelensky's been talking about it since last spring. The Russians finally went along, and I interpret that as Putin's decision to give Trump a little bit of something, because he's been refusing every proposal the president has put on the table since March of last year. Interestingly, out of Abu Dhabi, we've been hearing good things from from Ukrainians, Americans, and Russians about the talks, although no details. So consider me skeptical on that. We've also heard, not quite related to Davos, not quite related to Abu Dhabi, Zelensky described the security guarantee document between the United States and Ukraine as finished. And Zelensky says he's pleased with it. We have no real details beyond that. There were details several weeks ago after Mar-a-Lago, but nothing since this has been announced, except, and I find this peculiar, and I'm not certain what to make of it, they're talking about, it being a 10-year agreement. If we recall at Mar-a-Lago, the U.S. was willing to do 15, and Zelensky was talking about 50. How he got 10, I have no idea. Also, and this is not quite news, Zelensky said this will be ratified by the Senate. I'd like to hear the same from the White House. But nonetheless, this is a let's watch this space situation. And I think I probably talked too long, more than I usually do.
Well, but very, very interesting. And Dan, I will let you come in and take over the floor from here for a few minutes.
John,
Actually, there's one other issue I should have mentioned regarding the way Trump referred to NATO and NATO's work with us, fighting with us. I think Debra is eloquent on this, and I'll leave that to her.
I think John gave a good summary of the last few days of developments. The business about Greenland was, even by the standards of the Trump administration, disruptive and for no good reason. John was right when he said that every security interest the U.S. has in Greenland and the Arctic could be achieved under the existing framework of the 1951 agreement. And Trump's speech at Davos had no viable arguments whatsoever for our claims to Greenland. And then later that day, he just retreated from it. Debra Cagan is eloquent on the subject of Trump's insults against allies, but I'm going to add my 2 cents. I'm one of the people who, during the Bush administration, encouraged NATO allies to send forces to Afghanistan and Iraq. Some of those troops didn't come home. To insult those allies who fought alongside Americans is both objectionable on moral grounds and on grounds of common decency, and it also does not serve U.S. interests. When we need our allies again, who will step forward in the face of Trump's demeaning words? So there's no other better way to put it. On the issue of Ukraine, John summarized where we are, and interestingly, Ukraine is one area where the Trump administration has shown perseverance and a degree of attention to detail. Now, I haven't seen the details of the security arrangements, but I've heard the same as John, that the Ukrainians think they're not bad. They're not Article 5. They're not Article 5 light, but they are much more than Ukraine had during the Budapest Memorandum, which was nothing, and much more than Ukraine got as part of the Minsk Accords, which wasn't much. They could be serious, but don't take my word for it. Trump allowed his negotiators to go farther than many expected, and Putin reacted with this panicky, ill-considered claim about Ukrainian drone attacks on a Putin palace, which means they're nervous. And if they're nervous, there's probably a reason. So I think that the Trump approach could succeed, but Russia has not fallen off its demand that Ukraine retreat from all of Donbass, which is a terrible idea. The one thing that happened at Davos that John didn't mention, and so I will, is that Emmanuel Macron gave a gift to Trump and the cause of Ukraine when he announced that French forces has seized a Russian Shadow Fleet oil tanker. That means that the U.S., with British and Danish help, seized one Russian-flagged oil tanker from the Shadow Fleet, and the French have seized another. That means precedent has been set, and it means the French think it was legal, and that is new leverage that Trump could use to put pressure on Putin. I think all of the professionals on this panel would love to write the talking points for either Trump with Putin or Steve Witkoff in the Kremlin, to the effect that time to cut the deal with Ukraine and agree to a ceasefire in place. Otherwise, we're going to go after your Shadow Fleet and your oil revenue. Look, I have dealt with foreign policy problems where we didn't have much leverage. On Ukraine, we do. The French gave it to us. Trump ought to call Macron and say, great job, let's work together to lean into the Russians so we land this deal. Whether he will is another matter. But that to me was the best piece of news that came out of Davos, and it's something we shouldn't easily give up. Anyway, all from me. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dan. Phil, you're on.
Okay, I didn't want to jump line on what your lineup was. I wanted to just absolutely emphasize something Dan said to make a point. This business of our administration belittling the service of some of the other nations. On a per capita basis, Georgia sent more troops to Afghanistan than America did. On a per capita basis, Georgia lost more troops in Afghanistan than the United States did. So there are examples of exemplary service by our friends and allies. And I'll jump back into wherever you had me in line before.
This is where I had you. This is where I had you.
Well, I just wanted to jump on Dan's wisdom there and make sure that people understand that there are some factual problems with these claims that our brothers and sisters won't serve. The other thing I would point out is this administration made a statement the other day that when it comes to NATO, we're pretty sure that something would happen that would drag us into a war, protect them, but we're not sure that they would come to our aid. And I think, once again, we need to remember that history is inconvenient to some people here, but Article 5 has only been called one time in NATO. And that's when NATO went to our defense at 9/11. Okay, so the history is absolutely opposite of what was claimed by this administration in a public announcement, and that is NATO has 100% already come to our defense, and we have yet to go to their defense. And frankly, in the current sort of climate, we should be the one that people are holding suspect as to whether we would live up to our Article 5 requirements. So the only thing I would like to add is just in a pure defense sense. This is more of a policy discussion, and I want to get off the stage. In a pure defense sense, we need to understand what it is that Mr. Putin is motivated by right now. I think this panel does. My guess is all 50 or so of our attendees do, but I'm not really sure that some in our administration understand what motivates Mr. Putin. And as many have said, he only respects strength. We have not shown strength in respect to Mr. Putin yet, I believe, in these negotiations. Mr. Putin, on the other hand, as was pointed out to by my compatriot John Herbst, the Putin regime has basically refuted or tossed aside all efforts, at least in the last year, I would offer for longer than that we have made for peace in Ukraine. And not only have they tossed them aside, but they fairly publicly rebuked Western leadership, and specifically the White House leadership in this matter. And according to my calculations, they're about 85% of the time immediately after an American overture, they slam with a big attack into Kyiv to make a point that they're in charge, not the West, and certainly the White House is not in charge. And so I think that it's time that we in the West, and specifically the United States, stand up here and be counted. And the last point I would make in a security sense, Ian has, I think John actually spoke to it as well as Dan. We have a lot of experience with how Russia meets its obligations under agreements. It's an extremely poor performance, like over, as we say in baseball. They are over in meeting their requirements. And so we need to go into this negotiation and make sure that the things that are agreed to are ironclad on our side so that we don't have another Budapest episode, and ironclad on Russia's side so that they understand that we mean business. Thanks for letting me talk.
Well, thanks, Phil. And Ian, the floor is yours. But I do note that President Zelensky has said that the agreement on security guarantees, as has been mentioned, is ready for signatures. I know that this is part of the discussions that you follow very, very carefully. And I'm curious to what you think and whether you know more than the rest of us. Ian?
Thanks, Robert. I'm pretty sure I don't know more than the rest of this team over here. But first, I just want to applaud Phil and Dan and for their statements concerning Trump's outrageous remarks about Allied contributions, particularly the sacrifices they made in Afghanistan, for that matter, or Iraq. I'm fully with them. And I'll get back to that because that's an important contextual factor now, shaping the context of the credibility of security guarantees that will be the underpinning for a lasting peace and military stability when this war ends. John had outlined really the flurry of activity that went on last week: the Trump-Zelensky meeting, Witkoff-Kushner visit to Putin, $800 billion recovery reconstruction initiative being pushed forward among the Europeans, trilateral meetings. But above all, that Zelensky statement really caught my eye. He said the deal is done between the United States and Ukraine, ready for signature. Let me add to emphasize 2 points. What Trump did in Greenland with his 70-minute speech, basically reflecting his contempt for Europe and his contempt for NATO, really undermined profoundly the confidence our allies have, not just in American leadership, but the confidence they have in America's credibility, the confidence they can have that the United States will show up if the gun goes off, so to speak, in a major contingency. That is damaging. It's going to take a while for that credibility to be restored. And then I want to add that another event last week that not many people are noticing, but the administration finally released its national defense strategy, the unclassified version of it. And it is basically a signal to Europe that you are more on your own. So when you think of Greenland, when you think of this national defense strategy, or the efforts, antics on Greenland and this national defense strategy, it's creating a context that has undercut the confidence, not only undercut the confidence of our allies in American leadership and commitment, it's done that also in the eyes of our key adversary in the European continent, which is Russia. And that is very concerning because that's going to affect the credibility of the security guarantees that Zelensky has apparently signed off on with the administration. And when you think about the security guarantees, there are 2 elements. There's the kind of the European-led deterrent force, which right now is just about a division when it comes down to commitments. A UK brigade, a French brigade, and a Dutch battle group, and some cats and dogs. I think that's well short of what's going to be required for a credible posture in Ukraine. For me, I defer to my colleagues here, that's about 3 divisions, not 1 division. But you could say it's progress because they weren't at a division 2 or 3 months ago. And then the second element, of course, is U.S. security guarantees. And we don't know what they constitute. We know there's been some progress. Before 6 months, 8 months ago, it wasn't even clear the United States was going to be involved in any way in security guarantees. So now we've got some kind of agreement, and there's rumor about the United States being part of the monitoring team, continuing to provide intelligence to the Ukrainians, and maybe even contributing some air power that would sit outside of Ukraine, ready in the event of an emergency. But we got to be ready, because this thing, if it's ready to be signed, it could come out. We need to be ready to assess it. And people are using the phrase NATO-like. What does that mean? I go back to the Cold War, and I think of 300,000 U.S. troops on the front lines with almost equivalent number of no more European and Canadian troops alongside of them. I think of 3 brigades in West Berlin, a U.S. brigade, a UK brigade, a French brigade. You know, that defines the standards of NATO-like. And it comes down to 3 elements for me. It's in-country presence, offensive punch, not just monitoring, but an ability to hit back Putin where he hurts, jeopardize what he values. And then the third element is robust U.S. leadership and presence in both the aforementioned, in country and as part of the offensive punch. That is how at least I'm going to be measuring the credibility of this security guarantee whenever it is rolled out. And by the way, I would add, just because it might be Senate ratified means nothing. Deterrence rests on presence, not paper. And we cannot forget that. And my fear is that the antics over Greenland, the defense strategy of the United States, is actually making it more difficult for the Trump administration to deliver a credible security guarantee. Because now, in light of these antics, in the light of these documents, presence becomes even more important in order for that credibility, in order for those security guarantees to have credibility eyes, not just in the Ukrainians and the eyes of the Europeans, but in the eyes of Putin.
Thank you very much, Ian. Debra, there's been references to you going to speak before you even got to the microphone, but the floor is now yours.
Well, I think my colleagues have very eloquently put these really important factors on the table. So let me be less eloquent. So a couple of things. The first is I do, and Dan and I have discussed this, I believe that Trump's statements about allies not coming to the defense of the U.S., of what happened in Afghanistan and elsewhere, were more devastating than what he did on Greenland. Because, and Ian spoke to this a bit, but I'll be more blatant here. I will not name names, but the day that statement was made, I received calls from 7, if not 8 allies, many of whom were high-level officials who are now retired in their governments, who had been in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And as Ian and Dan know, I was on the receiving end of phone calls at 3 a.m. from defense ministers when their troops were killed in Afghanistan to see what we could do to help them get transportation and get them home and get them the type of interoperable equipment that would have lessened those mortalities. And as Dan knows, for me, this was deeply, deeply personal. And it was appalling. And based on what I've heard, it was much more devastating than anything he did on Greenland. And I will say that it is one of those cases where truth is just inconvenient here. So why let it get in the face of conjecture? So that's the first thing. But the connection that Ian made, I think, is the most significant here, which is that this statement and what it told the allies was much more devastating for how seriously you can take a security guarantee from the United States than anything else on Greenland. So it's not just having people and the bodies in place, it's having a willingness to do something, because Article 5, as we know, can either be accepted or rejected. And we've seen countries reject Article 5 support. And General Breedlove, you're back, and you know this about the reaction of the Allies about helping Turkey during the early days of Iraq, and a number of countries refused to invoke Article 5 to do that. So it is a great on paper, but it's theoretical until it comes time. Now, not only do the Allies have a new impression here based on the statements on Afghanistan, which were just, I think, came out of a page of a Pete Hegseth book where he talked about Allies not doing anything. And forgive me, that was pretty humorous to me because this is someone who's never gone outside the wire, but we won't go there. And I told you I was going to be less eloquent, but if you're an ally and you're committing to some peace assurance force for Ukraine, you will also want to know what is that red line for the US that it would come and help you, not just the Ukrainians. And I would argue that today, the lack of certainty, despite what's on paper, among allies is very high. And which means that even though Zelensky's saying all the right things, that this is a great piece of paper, I've got to be sitting there thinking, if this is the response to your closest allies who have Article 5, how's this going to be implemented for me? You know, Senate ratification or no Senate ratification. And then I'm glad you raised the posture review, Ian, because if you look at this version, this was never about China. China's not even a priority in this. It was never about China. It was never about, I have to go focus on the Indo-Pacific because, you know, I can't focus on Russia and the Europeans. It's never about China. This is all Western Hemisphere. And forgive me, and John's heard me say this, but frankly, I could take some of my old street gang pals from Chicago in a cigarette both and knock off a lot of the dictators he wants to knock off in the Western Hemisphere. You know, not a really big challenge to, excuse my sassiness here, not a really big challenge to the US military. But this posture review shows that it's not about China. And as I've said before, you don't let NVIDIA do business in China if you're serious about China. You don't let a guy sell computer chips to China that has huge defense contracts. Just shouldn't be done. So it was never about China. So let's refocus on Ukraine here for a moment. I think it was interesting to hear Witkoff made his statement that we just have one tiny little thing left to decide, and that's territory, you know, because it's a tiny little thing. But I will paraphrase Sakir here on this, where, the current Sakir explained that, Western Donbass is a superhighway to Kyiv, and that's still the case. And that's why Putin wants it, because he knows it's just, 3 days and a dog sled, to use Trump's terms, to get to Kyiv, if you give up Western Donbass. So where am I at on this? There was one question that I read in the Q&As, which really, I just really disagreed with, which is that the allies aren't doing anything. And that's just not true. The amount of support Ukraine has gotten from allies, not only in NATO, but in the Pacific and elsewhere in the world, has been enormous. And the amount of money that they have put out for support for Ukraine now exceeds what the US has done in total. And so I will say that the Europeans and Pacific friends and allies have really stepped up in terms of money, in terms of buying arms and equipment, not just from this US pearl, but also from their own stocks, and from what they're making in Europe is huge, and it's enormous. And their amount of money for economics and reconstruction has been huge and enormous as well. So I would stop buying into this canard perpetuated by the Trump administration that they're the only ones who are doing anything here. And it's just not true. It's just not true. And I think that the question now is, will the US continue to support not just Ukraine, but its allies, and going forward and implementing whatever peace process comes out of this? Because I personally would have my own doubts. Excuse the lack of eloquence.
Thank you. Everybody has made interesting and expansive remarks that are need to be looked at a little bit more. I'm going to come back to you, John. Now that everybody's commented after you have, Do you have things to add, both from Davos and from what's been said here?
I think there's one point that needs to be mentioned. It's a good thing, even though we don't have the details, that a security agreement has been reached between the United States and Ukraine that appears to satisfy President Zelensky. But that agreement, which again I think is a good thing, without having all the details, underscores the foolishness for the United States of in any way countenancing the possible transfer of heavily fortified Western Donbass from Ukrainian control to Russian control. Because there's no question, if Putin gets that territory, which his army has been unable to take, it does open the road to Kiev and to the entire left bank of the Dnipro River. And if U.S. is taking on security guarantees, that makes it more dangerous for us. So from that narrow perspective, which is a very important one, since we care about American lives and American interests, it's preposterous for us to do this. The security guarantees, yes, but not making it easy for the Russians to resume the war by giving them territory they've been unable to take militarily. And you'd think that people who put America first, and I don't doubt that, they would get this.
Well, I must say that there are a lot of things that I think the people in the administration should get. There's no evidence that they have gotten it. Phil?
Once again, I would just like to amplify something that John just said, and I am in violent agreement with him on this point, and that is Putin has crashed his army into the defensive wall that Ukraine has created, to the point that he's trashed his own army. And he now understands he will not be able to get through that wall. He is counting on the West, read the United States, to give him that victory that he needs, because he can't do it. And if we give him the rest of the Donbass, he is now beyond that wall. The idea of trading Donbass may sound like something that a real estate agent would want to do, but no military person would consider this a smart thing to do, because it just gets Putin past an obstacle that he now cannot get past. Thanks.
Ian?
Robert, if I could trump on your domain as a moderator and ask my colleagues the question, and you too, is what is the status of the other elements of the 20 or so point agreement? I mean, we're very much focused on territory, and I completely agree with my colleagues' concern about that. But what about these, the rumor that we'd heard before about a requirement for elections in Ukraine, but not Russia, a cap on the Ukrainian armed forces as if they started the war, no NATO membership, and others? Can you all share? I'll reflect my ignorance, but where are we on those points?
I'm sure Dan and Debra will want to comment, but I'll just start quickly. The short answer is we don't know. It's really quite striking how, when the dreadful 28-point document was put together, that was leaked almost immediately. But I think the fact that leakage caused great controversy persuaded the Trump administration to try and keep a close hold on details going forward. So the handover of Western Donbass to Russia was only one of the dreadful points from the 28 points. Others included, of course, the limit on the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian armed forces, the bizarre notion that Ukraine gets European loans or aid as part of the frozen Russian assets, whereas the United States and Russia gets at least 2/3 of those frozen assets for their own purposes. We have no idea where those things are.
Nice.
Um, I want to generalize from this discussion of Russian demands. I think it's a fairly safe bet that whatever deal is presented to Russia, they will demand more. Therefore, it seems to me since we're going to have to deal with Russian additional demands in any event, present them with a good deal rather than a bad deal. Don't present a deal to Russia after you've tortured the Ukrainians into accepting it in the hopes that that will convince the Russians to say yes. There is no deal other than Ukraine's surrender that Kremlin will accept without further demands. So you might as well present them with a solid deal rather than a bad one. Secondly, don't leave leverage on the table. Earlier, I mentioned the possibility of going after the Russian economy by going after the shadow fleet and oil revenue. Macron gave us a gift. Getting Europe and the United States ready to seize the Russian shadow fleet hurts the Russians. So stop chasing them. And if peace through strength means anything to the Trump administration and they keep citing it as a principle, show some strength. Oh, and a minor point, while we're listing Russian demands, don't forget that Lavrov, I believe, has recently reiterated the Russian demand that the Ukrainian government should not be allowed to remain in place if it has anti-Russian elements. Well, I kept thinking of Stalin's demand that communist governments he put in power starting in 1945 not be composed of any anti-Soviet elements. We've seen this movie before. Putin wants a subservient Ukraine, and we shouldn't give him something that he has been unable to achieve through 4 years of war.
Well, you make a point, Dan, that we've seen the movie before. I'm just not sure everybody's been watching it or paid any attention over the history of the last 50 years. There's, to me, the least experienced of this group. What seems to come out day in and day out of this administration is a lack of historic knowledge or appreciation and the fact that they're seeing things that everybody has seen before. Debra, you always have whether you call it diplomatic or unvarnished or whatever, have great analysis of what's going on. I don't see how we keep. I guess we've given credit to this administration for being persistent to try and come up with a deal. But it also, we've seen over and over that Russia has shown absolutely no interest in ending this war. Why is it, or is there a way to get to the fact that the way to stop Putin is to stop him? And we can allow the Ukrainians to do that if we give them what they need to do it.
This is a multi-administration problem.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so this goes back to the Obama administration as well about, when Obama talked about how he really disliked Putin, but he refused to take him on. I mean, let's be honest here. There was no way that Assad, who was genuinely an incompetent murderer, along with, the Iranians, were able to aerosolize chemical weapons without Russian help. So what happened in Idlib and elsewhere in Syria, where hundreds of thousands of people were murdered, Russia helped do that. And instead of having a red line, Obama said, no big deal, because I need him for my Iran agreement. And so that gave Putin free license to continue behaving the way he behaved. And ergo, what he did in Libya, what he did, elsewhere. on this and Ukraine because it was a gimme. And Putin realized the U.S. wasn't going to stand up to him, so he just did what he wanted to do. And then fast forward to the first Trump administration, where there was a lot of protestations and public cry, but it was mostly just let me reach out to this guy because I can talk to anyone and convince anyone of anything. And then the Biden administration, where what I call the ultimate four-letter word escalation came into play. And I think and this may be devastating for the Trump people to hear, but I think Trump is behaving a lot like Biden on Russia. And what I mean by that is I don't think this has anything to do with history or anything else. I think history is just inconvenient for this administration. They don't care. There's no shame, there's no humility. And history is just something that happened before that I had nothing to do with. I wasn't alive then, it's not my problem. And so I think looking at it through rational or that sort of lens is just not going to yield you with an explanation that you're looking for. So instead, I would argue that Donald Trump both admires Vladimir Putin and people like Xi Jinping because they run their countries with an iron fist. And they lock up their opponents and they get rid of their opponents and they're not allowed to have peaceful protests and they get locked up when they do that or shot at, whatever. You see a pattern emerging here. And also is afraid. And, because Trump's had discussions publicly about Russia and its nuclear weapons. And that is no different than what went on with Jake Sullivan in the Biden administration. And so I think what you have here is a president who believes that he could somehow get Putin to agree to something because he's the great negotiator, but who is also equally aware of Putin's nuclear capability and thinks he might actually use it. And what I think the missing link here, and it's been a missing link in multiple administrations, is that Vladimir Putin knows something that maybe we are refusing to admit to ourselves, is that if you go down that path, you will be dust. You will just be dust. And Putin knows that. But he believes that he could what is the word in boxing, John? You can out-deke your opponent. You can, do the Muhammad Ali dance, the float like a butterfly and sting like a bee, right? And that he can outdeke you and believe that he's much more likely to do something awful than you are, and therefore that threat still stands. So I think we're looking at this through a lens of logic and rational, which is not at all in the calculation. And I think the calculation is still that fear that he will hold that sort of Damocles of nuclear over his head. And what he doesn't understand, and what a lot of people don't understand, is that Russia understands very well a guy named Harry S. Truman. And the crazy Americans didn't just use one nuclear weapon, they used two to end the war with Japan. And that is why people don't use nuclear weapons today and why the nuclear deterrent still works. Because if it didn't work, and there are people in the White House who believe that Trump will do this because it no longer is valid. If it didn't work, India and Pakistan would have gone after each other on this over Kashmir. Kim Jong-un would have gone after the South with his nuclear weapon, and Iran would have used theirs by now. Because it's a fallacy to say that they don't. They have enough for like 3 weapons. So that's the problem. The problem is there still is this fear. No one will call it that in the White House, but there is this fear that Putin can and would use nuclear weapons. And so there's almost this pre-capitulation to him. And that's why you keep seeing this push-pull, give them another chance. Maybe they'll come around to do this. And I just think we're not being honest about that. We're not being honest that we're still the greatest nuclear power here and they can be dust. Because I think certain things are just impossible for them to contemplate or understand.
Thank you. This may just be talking about, repeating the same thing, but Phil, you've talked many times over the last several years about you deter your enemy. You don't allow yourself to be deterred. And that's exactly what Debra is pointing out, that we are being deterred. We are not deterring the enemy. Do you have anything more to add about that?
Actually, no, I don't. Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is that all the great thinkers, Sun Tzu, Jomini, Clausewitz, that in their own way, they said, deter your enemy and don't allow yourself to be deterred. And what we have done and allowed Mr. Putin with his nuclear rhetoric to do is put us in a position where we are not using our strengths. And we need to begin to use our strengths and make sure that Mr. Putin understands it. And may I just stop because we're getting close to the end, but by saying that, often people ask me, what do we need to give Ukraine? And I disappoint them every time because what I tell them is what we need to give Ukraine is an absolute public, definitive policy that is proclaimed loudly and proudly to the world, saying, Mr. Putin, stop. The United States of America is not going to allow you to win in Ukraine. Now everybody, including his own people, hear it. And that's the first step to turning around the decision calculus in Mr. Putin's head, because deterrence is in the mind of the deterred. And we need to rearrange Mr. Putin's calculus.
Thank you. Thank you. We are getting close to the end. Why don't we do a wrap up, and we'll go in the same order that we started off with, final comments and so forth. But before we do that, I listened to an interview the other day that pointed out that in a conversation with Zelensky, President Trump asked, what did you do to stop the Russians coming into Crimea? And Zelensky said nothing. And he said, why? And Zelensky told Trump, because you told us not to. And apparently Trump did not know that and expressed outrage that we had said, don't do anything. You know, where does that put him if he gets, through hook or crook or pressure of any kind, gets Ukraine to agree to give Putin land that Putin could not take on his own? If he was appalled by what Obama did, why shouldn't we be appalled, maybe even in advance, to what he may be trying to do? Anyway, I just wanted to say that. I don't know if you want to incorporate any of that into your final comments, but we'll go the same order we did in the first. John?
Okay, the nuclear issue is very important. I think there's no question, it's documented that the Biden team, including the president, were intimidated by Putin's nuclear threats and did not behave in the manner you would expect a superpower to behave. I'm not so sure about Trump on this. He did the right thing when the Russians began to rattle their nuclear saber last summer. And he, according to the media, sent American nuclear subs closer to Russia. But having said that, the least wise advisors in Trump world swallowed hook, line, and sinker the Biden line on nukes and talked about, we can't help Ukraine because we wind up in nuclear Armageddon. We heard that from a variety of people, some of whom are now in the government. So that is part of their thoughts, and that's a problem. And now here's a related issue, which some people might find my comments controversial. Trump states every week that had he been president in 2022, the Russians would not have launched their big invasion. And when he made those points initially, which is the time of the big invasion, and since, I thought maybe that's true. But then you now have a record of 1 year of Trump in office, And that record contradicts that statement because with Trump in the White House, the Russian bombing campaign of Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, civilian residences, and cities is vastly greater than it was when Biden was in the White House. That, to my mind, says the Russians are not so much afraid of President Trump as they inflict more pain, more war crimes on the Ukrainian people. We're all aware that President Trump, it's already been mentioned, talks about a Reagan-esque policy of peace through strength. And we have yet to see the full strength of that applied to whether it's China or Russia, or maybe it has been applied in Iran and Venezuela. True peace through strength would make Moscow pay a price for those war crimes. And in the process, persuade Putin along the lines that Phil and Dan and Ian and Debra have all said to actually make peace. Because if we are fully in to make sure Putin cannot win in Ukraine, he cannot win in Ukraine.
Thank you, John. Dan.
President Trump could yet succeed in helping Ukraine resist Russian aggression. He could take a big win. He isn't doing so. And like John, I'm frustrated by the gap between the possibilities for Trump to succeed on an issue where he says he wants to succeed, on an issue where he could prove that he was more successful than Biden or Obama. He could yet do this. But to do that, he will have to stare down Putin. And he has sometimes increased the pressure on Russia with the sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil, but he hasn't driven it home. And his negotiators have made progress, but they have yet to stare down the Kremlin. And this can be done. This can be done. George W. Bush administration was slow to recognize the Russian danger against Georgia. But when it became clear that Putin might actually try to take the whole country, when the Russian army was on the road to Tbilisi, Bush took a very bold step. He had the U.S. fly a Georgian brigade from Iraq into Tbilisi. And when the U.S. military told their Russian counterparts that they were coming in, the Russian military basically threatened the Americans, and the American response was, we're coming in anyway. And the Russians turned around their forces headed for Tbilisi. It was a bold move. My point's pretty obvious. It can be done. It takes cool nerves and a determination to do what we say we want to do. Russia is a nuclear power. Well, so are we. So let's hope we discover our strength while there is time for a strategic win for Ukraine and for us all.
Thank you. Phil?
I've really already made my closing statement just a second ago. Slava Ukraini.
Okay. Thanks, Phil. Ian?
It's hard to beat Phil's last remark there, but I want to build on Dan's point about leverage. You know, my big fear right now is that we're in a situation where my sense is that we, the United States, under Trump, are actually putting more pressure on Ukraine to accept terms that we're driving forward rather than pressure we're putting on Russia. And that's evidenced by the fact of our lack of response to a steady escalation of these last 2 months of its bombing of civilian infrastructure and civilian targets in Ukraine. To build on Dan's point, there's another story to be told. It's actually a Trump story. There was a U.S. outpost in Syria in 2017 that came under attack. It was under Trump, under General Jim Mattis' Secretary of Defense, that literally some 300, 350 Russian soldiers were destroyed within about 5 minutes. And that resonated powerfully with Putin. So Trump has a track record that can actually force Russia to respect an American deterrent. But the problem right now is that Trump is signaling quite the opposite, that he doesn't have a dog in this fight. He doesn't have a vital interest at stake that he's willing to fight for in the way he did in Syria. My point is that with a limited but substantive U.S. contribution to a deterrent posture, including in country, Trump could have his cake and eat it too. He could end this war. He would force Putin to end this war on just terms, on our terms, and actually create a situation where we have long-term military stability. And that is a far better path to a future of cooperation with Russia down the pike than actually giving Russia a victory in an outcome that would be a recipe for further Russian aggression. And I'm always surprised that Trump, who says he has the cards, doesn't seem to recognize how to play those cards for that outcome.
Thank you, Ian. Debra?
With everything everyone else has said, and one thing, look, it's great to be macho and take on Maduro and an Iran that has been so browbeaten by Israel. That's easy. But you know what? It's time to take on the big guy who allowed Iran to become what they were. And that's something always to keep in mind here. And I agree. He doesn't have to do a lot. He has to do something to say to Russia, we're not going to let you futz with this anymore. It's time for you to just stop and stop threatening them and stop threatening people and stop killing people. Don't tell us about how your wife wants Putin to stop beating up Ukrainian children. We'll see how far that goes. You show us how you're going to stop that right now. And I think, I believe in regime change, and maybe there's one due in Moscow.
Thank you, Debra. Thank you, everyone. It seems to me that the thing going back to the comments about Greenland and so forth, the argument that kept coming forward was that Trump wanted to protect us from Russia, and he needed to have what he didn't have, or he didn't think he had in Greenland to do that. Nobody was telling anybody that Greenland was going to be taken over by the Russians. If he was worried about the Russians, why wasn't he letting Ukraine defeat Russia and set back the threat of Russia for decades in Ukraine without upsetting all of our allies and so forth? I just hope that someplace in the White House, the president and whoever he's listening to realize that you don't need allies until you need them. Stop offending them. Thank you all. We'll see you soon. Take care. Stay warm. We're all in Washington at Phil, but he's getting an ice storm tonight. So goodbye for now.